Welcome to Chroma.Smile.Studio. In this video, we'll guide you through the first and most essential step in Exocad, selecting your restoration type. Each choice here determines the final result of your digital design. Let's start. Anatomic crown. We use this option when we want to design a full contour crown that already includes the final anatomy of the tooth. It's chosen for single or bridge restorations that will be milled or printed as the final restoration. This affects the workflow by letting Exocad create a full anatomic shape directly, ready for manufacturing. The tip here is to always check the material thickness. If it's too thin, it might break after milling. Coping. We choose coping when we plan to build porcelain or composite layers by hand. It creates only the internal substructure, not the full anatomy. This affects the workflow by reducing the crown's outer shape to leave a space for the veneering material. The tip here is to set the right reduction space. Around 1 millimeter is typical, depending on your ceramic. Pressed crown. We use pressed crown when the restoration will be created through a pressable ceramic process like Emax press. This affects the workflow by preparing the geometry for pressing instead of milling, including correct wall thickness and sprue placement later on. The tip here is to confirm that your material settings match the pressable system you're using. Eggshell crown provisional. We use this when we need to make a temporary or provisional crown. It's very thin, like an eggshell, and designed to be quick and easy to produce. This affects the workflow by focusing more on fit and speed rather than strength. The tip is to make the walls slightly thicker if the temporary will be used for more than a few weeks. Overlay. We choose overlay when we want to restore the occlusal surface but preserve as much natural tooth as possible. This affects the workflow by designing a partial crown that covers only the top and cusp areas of the tooth. The tip here is to make sure the preparation margins are clean and clear, so the software can define the overlay borders properly. Offset coping. We use this when we need to create a coping that has an intentional space or offset, for example, for cement or for layering material. This affects the workflow by adding a gap or compensation layer between the coping and the tooth. The tip is to use small offsets. Too much can affect fit and accuracy. Anatomic pontic. We choose anatomic pontic when designing bridges, and we want the pontic to have full anatomic shape that matches natural teeth. This affects the workflow by letting Exocad generate the emergence profile and tissue contact area automatically. The tip is to choose the correct pontic type, like hygienic or ovate, depending on soft tissue design. Reduced pontic. We use reduced pontic when we plan to veneer or layer the pontic later on. This affects the workflow by reducing the outer shape and leaving space for porcelain buildup. The tip is to match the veneering thickness between pontics and crowns to keep the final shape consistent. Pressed pontic. We choose pressed pontic when the bridge will be produced using pressable ceramics. This affects the workflow by preparing pontic geometry compatible with the pressing process. The tip here is to make sure the material and press parameters are set before exporting. Eggshell pontic provisional. We use this when creating a temporary bridge or mock-up where strength is not a big concern. This affects the workflow by generating a thin, lightweight pontic design that's easy to print or mill quickly. The tip is to add reinforcement or thicker walls if the provisional bridge needs to last longer. Mock-up. We choose mock-up when we want to make a diagnostic or aesthetic preview for the patient, like a digital wax-up. This affects the workflow by producing a printable or millable model used for visualization or try-in. The tip here is that mock-ups are great for patient approval before starting the final restoration. Inlay-onlay. We use this option when we want a conservative restoration, not a full crown that replaces part of the tooth structure. This affects the workflow by generating a partial coverage design that follows the preparation outline exactly. The tip is to check insertion direction and margin smoothness, so milling will be accurate. Offset inlay. We choose offset inlay when we need a small internal gap between the restoration and the prepared surface, for example, for cement space. This affects the workflow by adding a uniform offset inside the inlay geometry. The tip is to keep this offset small, usually around 50 to 100 microns, depending on the milling machine. Veneer. We use veneer when we want to restore only the visible front part of a tooth, usually for aesthetic cases. This affects the workflow by creating a very thin restoration that covers only the facial surface and follows your margin line precisely. The tip here is to check minimum thickness. Most materials need at least 0.3 to 0.7 millimeters. Anatomic waxup. We use anatomic waxup when we want to digitally reproduce a full contour waxup for milling or printing. This affects the workflow by letting us copy mill or print a wax model that matches the desired final shape. The tip is to export the design as an STL for easy manufacturing. Reduced waxup. We choose reduced waxup when we plan to layer porcelain later and need space for the veneering material. This affects the workflow by automatically reducing the outer surface of the waxup by the selected amount. The tip is to make sure the reduction matches your layering plan for consistent results. Pontic waxup. We use pontic waxup when designing diagnostic or final pontic shapes in bridge planning. This affects the workflow by creating pontic designs with ideal emergence profiles and anatomy for mock-ups or pressings. The tip is to pick the pontic style, like ovate or saddle, depending on tissue condition and hygiene. Now, these next 9 options are used for removable dentures, so we don't need them for our current case. Don't worry, we'll cover all of them later when we get into removable prosthetic design. Antagonist. We use this option to mark the opposing tooth or arch as an antagonist. This affects the workflow by letting Exocad calculate occlusal contacts and collisions during design. The tip is to make sure the antagonist scan is properly aligned for accurate contact analysis. Adjacent tooth. We choose adjacent tooth to mark the neighboring teeth beside our restoration. This affects the workflow by defining contact points and emergence profiles automatically. The tip is to check that adjacent teeth are selected correctly before generating contacts. Adjacent tooth. We choose adjacent tooth to mark the neighboring teeth beside our restoration. This affects the workflow by defining contact points and emergence profiles automatically. The tip is to check that adjacent teeth are selected correctly before generating contacts. Thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to work with us or have any business inquiries, just send us an email at our email address. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more Exocad tutorials from Chroma.Smile.Studio.